There is this profound and I think recurring cultural lie that this book just sets out to shatter from page one,
What's the lie?
that there were no women in Vietnam. It's a line that gets repeated over and over in the story, and it's really the central point of historical erasure the whole narrative is built to fight.
It's more than just a mention, isn't it? That lie is the foundational urgency for the entire novel. In rhetorical terms, it's the book's exigence, the thing that compelled the author to write in the first place.
Exactly. It signals to you, the reader, that you're about to read a testimony designed to replace that lie with the raw reality of lived experience.
So let's get into it.
Okay, let's unpack this deep dive into Kristin Hannah's novel, The Women. Enjoy a bold new take on book coverage with this extended analysis. More than just a summary, which we also include, this feature examines how the author shapes argument, builds influence, and earns or loses your trust.
This really gives you the tools to read with sharper insight and greater discernment.
Should you read this book, this should help. It's also excellent for aspiring writers. And if you find this expanded format valuable, we'd love to hear from you. Your feedback helps guide our future content.
And our mission today is really to focus on how this book foregrounds those erased experiences of Vietnam-era servicewomen, specifically the nurses, and challenges these deep patriarchal myths about war and heroism.
Right, and who history even decides to remember. Before we start, a quick note. You are experiencing a unique two-host AI conversation powered by Google's Notebook LM for deeper, more dynamic book analysis.
Okay, so to really appreciate the scope here, we should probably start with the author, Kristin Hannah. She's one of America's most successful novelists, born in 1960.
And she has a very specific niche, doesn't she? Character-driven historical fiction, almost always centered on women navigating huge crises. I mean, think of The Nightingale or The Four Winds.
Precisely, and this is the key point. Her ethos is that of a popular storyteller, not an archival historian. She's part of a generation who grew up under the shadow of the Vietnam War. She said she drew on memoirs of actual nurses.
So the story is fictional, but it feels authentic because it's rooted in that reported truth.
That distinction is just vital. It means she's prioritizing what we might call affective truth. She's not aiming for exact dates or unit movements. She wants the representative emotional and psychological experience of these women.
Wait, if she's prioritizing that kind of emotional truth, isn't there a risk of sentimentalizing the history? Does she ever cross that line into melodrama, or does the sheer trauma documented prevent that?
That is a sharp question. It's the tightrope walk of all popular historical fiction. I think Hannah stays on the right side of it, largely because the source material, the nurses' actual lives, is so inherently harrowing.
So her purpose is really twofold.
Yes. First, to restore women nurses to the moral and, I'd say, mnemonic center of Vietnam storytelling. And second, to issue a serious critique of the gendered and political abandonment these veterans faced when they came home.
And she gives you an incredibly accessible entry point to all this with the protagonist, Frankie McGrath. She starts as the very definition of privileged naivete.
Oh, completely. From Coronado Island, steeped in this romanticized, almost movie-like patriotism. She joins the Army Nurse Corps thinking war is noble, clean, a way to honor her dead brother.
That starting point, that naivete, it's a brilliant rhetorical move.
It is. If Frankie started out cynical and traumatized, you might feel distanced. But she enters the conflict with the same idealized view of war many of us might hold. So when the brutal truth of Vietnam reshapes her moral vision, it reshapes yours right along with her.
We learn the truth through her shattering loss of innocence, so she's using that journey to build credibility or ethos. But how does she make Frankie's fictional life feel believable to people who might have actually served?
She anchors it in documented historical patterns. The trust is built by making sure Frankie's story aligns with the facts. Female nurses did work in frontline combat hospitals. They were exposed to napalm and Agent Orange injuries, and they did face severe PTSD and institutional neglect.
By making the context ring true, we trust Frankie's emotional journey inside that context.
Exactly. But if we're talking rhetorical appeals, the dominant force field of this book is definitely pathos emotion. This isn't just a sad story, it's a devastating one.
And you mentioned there are two distinct types of emotional appeals being used here.
I think so, yes.
Yeah.
First, there's the visceral shock. These are the active combat scenes. The field hospitals being overrun, triage happening by firelight during bombardments.
The descriptions of the trauma they're treating, young men mangled by shrapnel, the specific smell of napalm injuries. Those scenes are designed for immediate horror.
That's the high-octane drama. But then there's the second type, which is, in a way, almost more chilling. the moral outrage.
That's the quieter devastation. It's what Frankie faces when she gets back home.
Right. These scenes are designed to make you feel grief, despair, a sense of systemic betrayal. The constant gaslighting from the VA, the refusal of her own family to acknowledge she even served. Some people just assume she was the secretary.
The neighbor who asks, "Did you have fun?" after she just spent 2 years watching men die on her operating table. That refusal to witness her sacrifice.
Precisely. And that silencing leads directly to what we see. Failed relationships, addiction, suicide. The trauma isn't just the war. It's the home front's refusal to validate that service. It's a powerful moral indictment.
So all of this emotional testimony then brings us to the underlying logos, the logic of the argument. It's not a strict deductive argument, it's inductive.
That's a great way to put it. The reader infers the claims about gender, war, and memory by following Frankie's painful path. It's less about saying this is true and more about showing thousands of small truths that add up to an irrefutable conclusion.
And the most powerful logical claim is that contradiction we started with. You, the reader, just spent hundreds of pages in these vivid scenes of women nursing under fire, doing life-saving work.
And that lived experience is immediately contrasted with that pervasive cultural line. We don't remember any women serving in Vietnam. That disconnect, that institutional falsehood, just exposes the gender bias in our memory. The logic is unanswerable.
Hannah doesn't have to argue that women served. She just showed you they did.
Before we move on, we want to take a moment to mention Mindful Moments, our YouTube channel offering AI book analysis, summaries, and critiques, all to inspire reflection and rational thought.
Okay, so this trajectory from sheltered girl to combat vet to traumatized citizen, that really is the structure carrying the argument. It's a very deliberate construction.
And you see it most clearly in the novel's macro-organization. The book is split right down the middle, Part 1 in Vietnam, Part 2 in the United States. That structural mirroring is a powerful rhetorical device.
It almost creates a dual narrative of war. Part 1 is the visible war, the mortars, the casualties. Part 2 is the invisible after war. The structure itself argues that the home front can be just as lethal to a veteran's psyche.
Yes, it juxtaposes the visible battlefield with the internal social war of PTSD and isolation. The book suggests this second war society's refusal to honor their sacrifice is what ultimately devastates them. The conflict doesn't end when the planes leave Saigon.
And Frankie herself isn't just a person. She's designed to be more than that, isn't she? She functions as a kind of composite lens.
A composite lens, exactly. She's a vehicle. Multiple female veteran experiences converge in her. If Hannah tried to tell the stories of a dozen different nurses, the narrative would fracture. By funneling those documented truths through Frankie, she keeps the focus sharp.
Which is why her friends, Barb and Ethel, are so important. They aren't just side characters. They broaden that lens. They show different classes, different coping mechanisms. It ensures the title, The Women is Truly Plural.
Right. It's a relational identity, not the story of a single heroine. The book also weaves in romantic love, like Frankie's relationship with Rye, with all the war trauma.
It shows how affection can be a temporary escape, but also how it can distort judgment under that kind of overwhelming stress.
And when those relationships inevitably collapse, what's left is that deep, gnawing sense of betrayal, which brings us to what we call moral injury.
That's the essential term for the post-war section, I think.
It is. Moral injury is that devastating sense of being used, betrayed, or forced to violate your own ethics. The book frames this as a political wound, not just a psychological one, because the betrayal comes from the system, the government, and the society they served.
They signed up to help, and their service was not only ignored, but in some cases actively mocked. That's a heavy weight.
It is. And the path to healing, as the book shows it, depends less on official institutions, which repeatedly fail her, and much more on grassroots solidarity. Her recovery happens by connecting with other women veterans.
In spaces like The Last Best Place, where their experiences are finally named and believed.
It models a relational ethic of care, a community-driven response to trauma. It's an implicit critique of the hierarchical male-centered versions of honor and service. The system was broken, so the women had to fix it themselves.
Now we should talk about the complexity of representation in a book this big, designed for a massive audience.
This is an important and necessary discussion. As the book's gotten more attention, some readers have raised concerns about racial representation, specifically the centering of Frankie, a white protagonist.
There are Black and Vietnamese characters, but their experiences are often seen through Frankie's eyes. They serve to catalyze her moral awakening, but we don't always get their full stories.
And this reflects a common rhetorical trade-off in popular historical fiction. To reach the broadest possible audience and make sure that central argument that women served is heard widely, the story often orbits a character designed for majority audience identification. It's a commercial strategy, really.
It's a difficult choice for an author. The technique succeeds in recentering a marginalized history, the story of American servicewomen, but it also dictates whose voices remain mediated.
Right. It prioritizes maximizing engagement with the core message, but it raises valid questions about whose stories still need their own dedicated platform.
It's a crucial perspective for any critical reader, but ultimately the book performs a kind of symbolic revision of who gets to be a hero. It doesn't end on a note of passive grief.
No, it ends with action. It concludes with Frankie dedicating herself to creating a hero's wall, a tangible monument that specifically foregrounds women and their service. This is the final move.
It invites you, the reader, to reimagine what belongs on our monuments, what goes in our history books, and whose stories deserve to be central to our national memory.
The combination of accessible prose, emotionally intense scenes, and a clear injustice makes the book incredibly effective at moving a broad readership from indifference to engagement.
So for your next step, we'd suggest a focused comparison. Take The Women and put it side by side with a nonfiction Vietnam nurse memoir. Use that to critically examine where Hannah's techniques prioritize emotional truth over documentary precision.
And think about why that distinction matters for critical, rational reading. What does the storyteller gain with creative license, and what does the historian preserve by sticking to the facts? Both forms of truth have value, but they achieve different things.
Click the link on screen for the in-depth book summary. Subscribe, share, purchase via link, and think rationally.
See the many genre-based book podcasts at Mindful Moments. Subscribe and nourish your mind on the go.